We're live. A quick reminder before we get started with class stuff today is that this is the last class for this sort of intermediate session. And then we'll be taking a break, and I will make sure I post a message with the exact date, but we're going to be starting like the week after the 4th of July, because I'll be gone that whole week. So we'll be starting back up then with the React stuff. And I still need to follow up on a couple things, the Cloud9 information and what's going on there and where the next class will be, whether it's here or at the frontier. So again, let me know if you have strong preferences one way or another. So I just need to check and see what the plan will be for that. Any other questions or anything before we start talking about events? So for some people, this may be old, again, that's the case for a lot of these topics, but I want to make sure that everyone's had a chance to sort of get introduced to the way this stuff works, and what we're talking about. And today I'll probably spend a little bit of time, even off the slides here, just trying to relate event-driven programming to the real world a little bit, because it's a different model than what we're used to. Even start with a little bit of that, but we're used to, in the way that we've been writing our code, we've been doing stuff very either linear or in a way that the code, even if the code doesn't run directly like top to bottom, the code runs when you run your program, and it just executes whatever portions of code it needs to execute. Sure, maybe you can pass in some variables that'll change the path it takes or something like that, but it's more or less just running your program. Event-driven programming is very different than that. It's a whole different model, and it's much closer. It's probably easier if you're thinking about it to think about just the real world, because we all operate this way already. We've got a bunch of events that change the actions that we're going to take. That's pretty much what we do. I'm driving my car and the low gas light pops on. Well, that tells me I now need to queue up an event to go to a gas station and get gas, where maybe that's, that wasn't part of a script. Like, I didn't write out my script for the whole day. It's just these different events are happening that change what needs to occur. Live server went down. Okay, that's an event, and I'm going to quit whatever I was thinking that I was going to work on, and now my priority is fixing the server so that our customers aren't impacted, right? All the way to, sporting events are probably one of the best examples of this, because you have all sorts of small events all over the place, right? Like, there's not a script of exactly how it's going to take place. He pitches a fastball, that's different than pitching something else, and what base you throw it to. All of those are just real world event driven things. And yet in our code so far that we've been writing, we really haven't had any way to sort of change our behavior just off of events, or have an event that's not driven by us change what our code does or run some bit of code. And that's what we're going to be talking about today in the context of the DOM. So in the context of a web page, but there's definitely it's a broader concept. Being able to have event-driven programming is a much broader concept than just working inside of a web page. Because there's a whole bunch of other types of event-driven things that occur. And there's entire languages that have evolved to be event-driven, and that's sort of the way that they interact with everything around them. But as I said, we're going to be focusing on a web page. So the first thing to realize here is that most of the actions that happen on a web page, most things that can occur, trigger an event of some kind. So these DOM events are sent to notify code of interesting things that have taken place, right? That's this binding. Oh, I've got an event happen. Something occurred in my web page. So when I said most things, here's just some examples of the events that can be created in the browser. Some of the things that exist is, probably the most common one right here at the beginning. You got a click event, right? You can have a double click event. And these are written this way specifically because these are actually the event names in the DOM. So that's, if you're like, why there's no space between some of these, this is the exact name you'll see why that's relevant in a minute. But click mouse over, mouse leave. So you can detect just that a mouse is over something or it left something. Mouse down, that you're using the wheel on a mouse. We can detect when somebody pushes a key down, when that key comes up, or an event that attempts to aggregate that into a key pressed. So that doesn't say down or up. That is when the key was pressed, it's a little bit aggregation of it. You've got scrolling, they're scrolling the web page. You've got resize, if they resize the browser window. Cut, copy, and paste can trigger events that you can respond to in some way inside of your website. When the web page loads or attempts to unload itself, it fires events. When an error happens on your page, if some element on your page gains focus, so you've got an input box and somebody's clicked into it, can fire a focus event. When they click out of it, there's actually a blur event that can fire or fires that says, oh, this no longer has focus, right? And the key thing to remember at all this is really not to memorize all of these. Some of these are going to be ones that you will use quite frequently when you're doing web development. Some of these are ones that you just get comfortable working with. But there are a lot of events that can be fired. This is a really small subset. The number's probably, I don't know, 100, somewhere between 100 and 200 different events, I'm guessing, in general, that exist in most web browsers in some way. But that means that there are a lot of things inside of your website, a lot of things happening that you can hook into and observe and change the behavior of in some way. So that's what we're going to play with a little bit today. We're going to do some stuff. Just how do you work with events? What are these like? Well, just like we were talking about the DOM, the document object model, and everything is represented as an object in the DOM. Every event is also an object. So every event that occurs is represented as an object of some kind. So if we went over and different events create, we'll step over there in just a second. Sorry, different events create different types of objects. But one of the key things is all of them inherit from the base event object. So every event that occurs in your website inherits from this base event object. So let's go ahead and just look at that a little bit. Examine this sort of base event object and some of the documentation around it to get a feel for what we're talking about when we say that everything inherits from this. And can I collapse that? It gives me a drag and then it doesn't move. All right, let's look at it right here. So this is some documentation on just the event object. It's really just this documentation. So we can look at it from either place. Oops. Oh, there we go. Now it changed and just showed this. And then you can see I've said that different events, different types of events will fire be different objects, but they all inherit. These are all different specific event types that can exist. And so you'll see some of these, a mouse event. That includes things like that click or double click or mouse over or mouse leave. Wheel event, that's a mouse event, but of another type. You've got pointer events. Pointer events are interesting because they're an attempt to bring together touch events and mouse events into one event type, because with touch devices, we have a whole nother set of events that we have to figure out how to handle. And that's created some conflict in terms of figuring out how to make all that work. But all of these are just subclasses. They inherit from this event class. So what does this event class have on it? Like, what are some of the properties we're going to have on any event that we have? And some of this, you don't need to know every little detail of what's going on, but we've got some information about bubbling and canceling bubbling. That gets into how the DOM works with events, which I'm not going to talk about in detail today, but there's this whole process about how it figures out where to, or what events to fire. Because if you think about, you've got let's go back to our table that we were talking about in the last class, right? With some nested elements, you could put events listeners on the row of the table, but you could also put them on an individual cell or the table as a whole, right? And let's say you put a click handler on all of those. Which one of those fires when you click inside of a cell? And the answer is, unless you tell it not to, it'll fire all of them all the way up this chain. And so there's some logic that you can do, but it does it in a specific order. And there's a way to connect to that, or then say, oh, stop firing other events, because there's a lot of complexity in what's going on there. We're going to be focusing more just on the basics of hooking up to a simple event and firing it right now, as opposed to this sort of bubbling structure of how the events work. If you're interested in that, I'm happy to talk about all of that. Other information, what else do we have here? Again, I always really strongly recommend just go read on some of this stuff sometimes. Be inquisitive and say what's going on. We've got event.currentTarget. This is a property on it, which is a reference to the currently registered target for the event. We have what phase is the event in? And that goes back to this bubbling, that bubble bit that was mentioned up at the top. Original target, the original target of the event before any retargetings. But this one only applies in Firefox. We have just target. This is the one that is much more commonly used, which is a reference to the target for which the event was dispatched versus where you're at the point that it's running. And we also have like type, pardon me. And then we even have some methods on the event. We're not going to dig into all of these right now, but these are just useful methods that you can use to, say, create a new event or work with events that you already have. So if we can create an event that's not going to be, man, got a scratch in my throat now. We can just create an event, just like a new event, just giving it a name. It won't have all the useful information that we would want. A common convention is to just use EVT to represent an event as a variable name. You don't have to, but it's sort of a common way to say this is an event. I'm going to create one. And we're just going to give it a type of new event. And now we can look at like this event object in here, right? We've got all of these properties that we just talked about, which includes a timestamp for when the event was created. Here's the type. It's a new event. So it's not going to be a useful type because it's not one of the types that we're used to having. And then it doesn't have a target because it's not attached to anything in the DOM right now. We didn't connect it to some element in any way. Any questions about just the event object so far? The base of this? All right. So the rest of this will pretty much be just us playing around. I'm flying faster than I even expected. So I'm happy to have a much deeper conversation about working with events, playing around with this stuff. If you guys want to talk about some of the other things that I don't necessarily have in the slides, I can talk about some concepts of the bubbling aspect of events, because that's a powerful mechanism for creating events in an efficient way. But we'll start with just talking about event listeners and how do I actually connect to these events in some way. So to respond to the events happening on the page, you need to create an event listener, something that's listening to an event that's happening. And the key part here is to remember is event listeners are functions that will be called whenever the event they are attached to happens. So if you want to create an event listener, the first thing or the steps here are event listeners can be created in several different ways. We're just going to focus on using this add event listener method today. That'll be the way that we'll create event listeners. It can also be attached directly to HTML elements. That is sort of the traditional way to have created them early on when JavaScript wasn't, you weren't building a whole web page with JavaScript. When you were just sort of adding a little bit of enhancement, is you might just inline it right on your HTML elements or attach some stuff there. It's still a useful thing. The reason I don't focus on it when we're teaching JavaScript or how to build stuff, especially using React, is because that doesn't really translate to something that you can put into code very easily and have in a dynamic fashion. So it's really useful if you're one-offing, I just want to test something, I want to attach a quick event listener here and do some testing in the browser. Yeah, it's useful, but it's not very programmatic. So that's why we're sort of focusing on the approaches that are easier to code. Yes?
Does inheritance follow with that? Like if you had an event listener in your HTML code, you should also add an event listener to do something to that same tag element, which gets followed.
We can, you know what? So I said we'll focus on one. I can show a little bit of what'll happen there as well, and we can play around and just see. Some of that behavior over time has changed just a little bit. I think I know what's going to happen, but it might be worth experimenting to see. So I can show both. And honestly, it probably makes sense to show attaching them directly. Because what's weird is when you get into React code, you end up writing stuff that looks like you're attaching them directly that way, even though you're not. But add event listener is definitely the canonical programmatic way to attach them. And so, yeah, I can look at some of that and we can talk about how that works in more detail. So what are the steps you need to do call this add event listener method to be able to do this? There's really 3 things that you need to put together to succeed with this, right? First, you need to get a reference to the element that you want to attach your event listener to. So let's say we're just going to go ahead and continue building off of what we were doing in the last class, right? Let's pull up this documentation for the DOM. And just like last time, we're going to grab a reference to the H1, which is just this first element in the page. And I used query selector so that it gave me back just one, as opposed to query selector all, which would give me back an array-like object of the elements, because I also happen to know there's only one H1 on the page. So it was just some prior knowledge that made it easy for me. So that's the first thing that you need, is some sort of reference to your element. And we'll be showing some examples, or I'll work through another example where instead of just one, maybe we'll do something over a collection of them like we have before. The next thing you're going to need, which is what I talked about, was you need a function that can be attached to the event listener action. So we need to create some sort of function that we can attach that's going to get called. The function's going to get called each time the event is fired. This is something that trips people up a lot when they start switching over to writing code this way, and I'll show you the common mistake that's made as maybe the first thing. But what trips people up is that they will, when they're trying to create the event listener, they will write the code that they want to happen each time right there. But the problem is it will evaluate that code and run it only once, as opposed to evaluating it when that event fires. So I'll sort of show you what I'm talking about with that. And the key aspect about the function, any function that you want to have as your sort of event listener, is the event object that gets created when an event happens gets passed in as the first parameter to your event listener. So whatever function you're hooking up here, your event object is actually going to be that first parameter that actually gets passed in. So if we're working with this, and I'll just copy this over. I think this is a little easier copying. Is I've created a log event function, and I know that this event is going to be the first, an event object is going to be the first thing passed in when this gets invoked. All right, so then what I want to do in this is I'm just going to log something. I'm just going to say what got clicked. So nothing fancy. And so I have now a function, but that function, I can't really just, I mean, I could call it with just anything, like I could call it here, but it's going to fail. because I didn't give it an event object. It tried to find the target off of something that didn't exist. So it's really just a function. Now, if I want it to be able to pass, I have to say I'm giving you an object, and then this will fail too, because now it'll say it can't find inner HTML because target was undefined. So then I would have to say I'm giving you an object with a target. I can just make that null, and now it'll be fine because, let me see, I could be wrong. No, wait, it's still no. The target needs to be an object. Now it should, oh, what am I missing? Bad syntax. See, welcome to coding. So now it passed, but it's just undefined, and that's because the inner HTML property of target doesn't exist. If a property doesn't exist on an object, you get back undefined. So it was a lot of hoops we jumped through just to sort of test it by hand. So now I've got the first two things that we need, which is we've got a function that we can call, and we've got a node or an element that we want to attach the event listener to. So the third thing that we need is we need to know what event we want to listen for. Like, what event do we want to attach to? And as I said before, here was this list of all those names. Well, let's just use probably the most common event, the easiest one to attach to and test with most of the time. Let's do a click event. So with those 3 bits of information, we can now call add event listener, because add event listener is a method on an element. So the H1 is our element, our DOM element. We've got the add event listener method, and it takes 2 parameters. You can pass in an optional third, which are some extra settings, but the 2 it needs are, it needs what event are you subscribing to or adding a listener for, and what action do you want to take, what function do you want to invoke when that is subscribed. So if we come back over here and we do h1.addEventListener, we want to attach a click event listener, and log event is what we want to be called. So now this h1 has an event handler on it, or listener. You'll hear me probably use those terms interchangeably because they get used back and forth. Handler versus listener. There's no difference between event handler and event listener, really. And so now when you click on this, it's executing that log event function, and which we should be able to, let me see if there we go, we can see the content of it again. Here's this log event function, and it's passing in the event as the argument when it calls log event. And that event has a target, which is the element that you clicked on, and that target is just a DOM element, just a DOM node, and so that has an inner HTML, just like we were working with yesterday, which just is the text of what we're clicking on. And Chrome here is nice. It doesn't spam my console as long as it's the same thing getting logged over and over. It just tells me how many times it logged. So it's just like, same thing's been logged over and over. Does this make sense? How we're hooking that up? So here's the common mistake a lot of people make when they're first doing this. Probably the most common mistake that gets made. Let me refresh the whole page so that we're just from scratch. Now we won't have any of the, I've got to reset up my JavaScript, because remember what we talked about yesterday or last class was every time you hit a new page, you lose all your context. So probably the most common mistake that people make is something like this. Okay, I want to hook up a click event listener. And what I want to have happen each time is I want to console log, like I was doing, I want to console log click every time. And what we'll see is we did click got triggered right there, but nothing's happening when we click here. And the reason is because this line got evaluated when we called this whole thing. It evaluated the console log and logged the click. but that's not actually a function that it can call again, right? We didn't give it something we didn't pass it a reference to a function. We accidentally instead just inlined what we wanted. That's probably the most common mistake that's made when people are hooking up event handlers, is trying to just directly execute it. And it's usually a little more subtle because you're not doing just this console log. Usually you've written something like, your event handler function, and you accidentally invoke it, or you invoke it using parentheses, just like we did with console log, instead of passing it in without the parentheses, which will be a reference to your event handler, or to the function, right? It's the difference between invoking it versus giving a reference. Yes?
Is there ever time doing it that way? School where you want something to only happen the first time it's done?
The key here is it's not actually even happening the first time you clicked. It's happening when it reads this line of code. So it's never happening the first time that you click on it. And yes, there are. That's a pretty common behavior, in fact. And so there's several ways to handle it. Although, to tell you the truth, there's actually a little bit of a gotcha around it. So we have add event listener. There's also remove event listener. So let's try that. Let's do something for fun. Now we're going to make a function that says log and remove listener. And this is going to take our event object. And all right, so what we want to do is we'll just console.log, just like we were doing. We clicked on element with content, event.target.inner HTML. This is a lot of stuff, so I'm sure I'm going to have a typo writing this much code. And then the next thing I want to do is, because I know what my target is, and remove event listener is the same thing, I can now remove, so I'll get a reference to my elements the same way, and I can remove event listener, and I need to tell it what listener I want to remove. I think this will work. Could be wrong, we'll see. I want to remove my click listener. So now I'm gonna add event listener to click, and what I want is to log and remove listener. And remember, I'm not using parentheses because I don't want to invoke it. I want to pass a reference to my function. Let's see if this works. Okay, I called remove event listener wrong, I believe. It says it requires 2 arguments. I only gave it 1. Let's see here. Let me see if I can figure out what the other argument is that I need to pass it. Oh, I need to pass it the actual function. Okay, so we can fix that. That makes sense, and I think you guys will see why in a minute, because you were talking about, attaching stuff directly versus not. You'll get to see a little bit of an example of why that makes sense in a moment. I think I need to refresh the whole page. Get a reference to this. I start creating this. Oh, I need my function first. My other function. Where's my function? Oh, wait, hold on. Log event. Oh, no, hold on. It should work, right? Log and remove event listener. Yes. This is going to be weird. What we were doing in this case is to click on it, just log the information, and then remove the event listener. So the next time I click, it will not call that event listener again. Let's see if this works. No, it's still on there. I got something wrong with it. Let's see if this works. Remove event listener, click. This may not have been legitimate. So you can see that, now it's not on there anymore. I removed it. So I think this was not a proper reference to my function in this context. Of course it wasn't. Yeah. It's because the way event listeners work. This won't work that way. That's the whole concept. That's the danger of sorry. You guys don't need to get into the details of that. But the goal was, like if you wanted to take an action one time, you could attach an event listener and then pull it back off afterwards. And speaking of that, you can attach event listeners multiple times, or you can attach multiple event listeners to the same event. So you can trigger multiple things to happen off of one event. You don't have to put those all in the same function. So if we go back here, let's just grab our earlier log event that we want. Put this in here, and then let's make another one. What else do I want to do? Let's do this. Let's just mess with it, right? Move element. We're gonna do some of the stuff that we were playing with last time again. So when the event happens, event.target.style.position equals relative, and then write some evil code here. I don't know if this will work. Try it, but and I need, okay, my H1, add event listener. So let's add one of these to the click first, the log event. So now when we click on it, we should be logging that we clicked on it, which is what we expect. But you can attach more than one event listener. So I'll take this same bit of code, and again, there's probably something wrong with my function here or something, but now it like jumps around my page randomly when I click on it. And you can see it's doing both of my actions because I've attached two event listeners to my element. So you can attach as many event listeners as you want using this add event listener model, which is one of the reasons why it's sort of the preferred approach as well to hooking up events. Because, let me go back, this is the one I said we wouldn't focus on, but I'll touch on it because you'll definitely see stuff around it. Let me find my H1. Let me get one of my functions, like this log event. All right. So the other way that is pretty common, and this is, you can do it inline as properties on it, but you'll see it done here too, is if you remember when we were looking at all of the properties on this object, we've got all these ons. That's the way that you can hook to events directly inside of the DOM or inside of your HTML by setting a property. And so if we want to hook up to the click event, it's not just like click, the property is on click. And then you can assign that to like your function. So now when we click, that fires, which at first you're thinking, oh man, why are you showing us this more complicated add event listener syntax when this is a lot easier to work with, right? All I have to do is, dot property equals. But one of the keys here is, let me get my other function back that we created, our evil one, is you can only have, when you attach them this way, you only attach one and it removes the other one. And so now you'll see it's moving around when we click, but it's not logging anymore. And that's because we assigned that value directly to that function. And so we can't have more than one value on that property, right? We can only have one. So anytime that you assign it to something else, it overrides any existing ones. So that add and remove, that allows you to attach multiple events to your, or event listeners to your event. Whereas when you write them this way, using like the on event notation, you can only ever have one hooked up that way. Does that make sense? Now here's the question I don't know the answer to. This is what I was gonna say is, so if we've got this move element and that's hooked up using this equals, now I don't know what the answer is. If we do an add event listener for click and we do that one as the log event, I'm not certain if this will fire and the move or if only one of them will fire. It looks like both of them work. So it looks like you could attach one directly and then do other ones using add event listener, but say usually you stick with one pattern or the other. Any questions on this so far? What do I have here? Let me check. I mean, this is most of the big concept, and then I wanted to play around a little bit more with some other event listeners and sort of show you some of the power, right? So just like we did last time, let's do something fun. If you don't mind, let's have some fun. All right, so I have a little snippet of code that you guys don't need to understand how it works, because you can save little snippets of JavaScript actually in your dev tools and pull them into a page if you want to use them. So I've got one here called random hex that will, now that I've run it, it's here on my page. I can get a random color, hex color back out. And so every time I call it, it'll be something different. And let's just have some fun where we will hook some events up to more than one thing on the page to have the page sort of dynamically change itself. So let's get all the paragraphs. Oh, look, it even remembers that I typed this in the other day. It's like, hey, you typed this recently. You want to reuse that? Yeah, I do. And then I have a random color function already. So I'm going to want, now I'm going to want to make some sort of event handler, event listener, which will be like, I'll call it change color. And this is going to take whatever the target is and the style, and let's change the background color. We could change the text color. What do you want to change, background color or the text color? Background color. It would be much bolder. So let's just get a random color. All right, so what do we have here? We've got paragraphs, but the problem is that's not one element, right? We have an array-like item, and we've got change color, but we've got our function that we could call. So now what we need to do is attach this to the events on these paragraphs. Now, I'll show you a couple different ways to do this. One of them will go into some of that bubbling, event bubbling that we talked about, which will be different than this approach. This approach, I'm going to attach it directly to each one of these paragraph elements. So the way that we do this is just like anything else, right? We just need to do some sort of loop, some sort of iteration over all of our elements, and then call this add event listener for each one of them. And we can do that a lot of different ways. Let me see, I've got a for each, which is gonna let me be a little lazy. So I'm gonna write using just this arrow syntax. I know it's the newer one, but shouldn't be that different. So for each paragraph into paragraphs, for that paragraph, I'm going to call add event listener, the click event, and then change color. That's what I want to be able to have happen. And I am missing something. Yes, you are correct. All right, close my for each. Let's see if this worked. I don't know. Hey, look at that. Oh, navigated away. Lost my stuff. See, all my cool stuff's gone. I just set up. All right, hold on. Let's get our paragraphs. Let me go reload my snippet into my page. I change color. All right, I think we'll work now. There we go. Giving each one a random color when I click it. Oh, this isn't in a paragraph. Not a paragraph. Oh, that's a little paragraph. Right? And you could hook up all sorts of stuff, right? We could, let's make it more spastic than this. I'm gonna remove all of these listeners real fast so that they shouldn't be on there anymore. Oh, are they still on there? No, that's just highlighting, right? Yeah. And let's make it even crazier. Instead of on click, let's do mouse move, I think. So now we've got seizure mode, right? Like every little movement of the mouse, it's invoking our event listener and changing our color. And we can remove that. And we could do something much more practical with that too, right? Like that mouse move is a great example of go try and look up the documentation for some of this stuff. We were talking, okay, wait, we've got some mouse events, right? That have extra information. That includes like what button is pressed, what my client X and client Y is. And in fact, it's really awkward because there's like a bajillion X and Ys. So it takes a little while to figure out which one you actually want. Like screen X, screen Y, client X, client Y. But let's say, oh man, I want to know where my mouse is whenever I'm over any of these elements. So let's change this a little bit. Function print mouse position for the event, and console.log mouse at, close this, close some stuff so that I don't, event dot client X event dot client Y, I think will be correct. I'm going to come in here and just change this instead of change color. Let's hook up the print mouse position. See if this will work. And we can see here, it's logging where our mouse is at whenever we're over a paragraph, right? So you can begin to see everything you could do. Like, oh, you could detect when you leave the paragraph. You can, detect that that paragraph is near the top of the page. There's tons and tons of useful information that you can pull out to decide what logic you want to do. You could say, oh, I only want to change the color if they're, at the bottom of the paragraph in some way, or I only want to change it if they're holding down a specific button at the same time. Right? Any questions on that? So this gets into the real power of how you can hook up and connect to everything going on in your DOM, right? How are you going to communicate between the JavaScript and your DOM? The vast majority of it is done through events of some kind taking place on the web page. And that's how you trigger bits of JavaScript to run that do different actions. Which again, the emphasis here is that that's just a very, very different model than what we've written for code so far, right? So you're writing these bits of code that will get invoked at different points, but aren't just running linearly. It's not just your program running. So now let's talk about just a tiny bit about this bubbling concept that I was talking about. So we hooked up a lot of events there when we did the paragraph connection. That was a lot of work for us to hook those up because we had to, I mean, not really that much now, but we had to go grab all of these paragraph elements and attach individual event handlers to them, which could also potentially be inefficient. Imagine, in this case, we only have, 20 paragraphs, right? Imagine that you are working with a spreadsheet-like bit of software or a spreadsheet-like website that has 1,000 or 10,000 rows in it. That's a ton of event handlers that you're hooking up when you're connecting all of those. So there's a lot of code going on there that maybe you don't need. So it's possible when you're hooking up event handlers, and this goes back again to some of this event target or event information, which we will look at, but it's possible to hook an event handler up to something higher up so that that's actually where the event handler is, but care about what element sort of you were on when it originally occurred. And this is another way that you'll see, especially if you encountered jQuery or other languages like that. This is a very common pattern for efficiency purposes, dealing with bubbling stuff like this. So what I'm going to do to sort of show that, and you don't need to know the details of this as much. This is more showing a little bit more of the underlying system and how it's actually working. Focus more on just the basics of the events. Is we could hook up something to this body element. Let's go back to we're going to do some crazy colors again. And we could do that in a way that's going to change the color, not of the element that the click is on, but of whatever element, it's sort of hard to explain. The element that you basically are over when you click, but not the one that the event listener is connected to. And if we go back and start looking at our event documentation again, there's a little hint in here about how to do that. Oh, maybe I have it over here better. Looked up the mouse stuff. Let's see what we have. Okay, so here's, I talked about target, right? A reference to the target to which the event was originally dispatched. That's what we're usually going to be using. But I said, there's some other targets in here. We also have current target, a reference to the currently registered target for the event. This is the object to which the event is currently slated to be sent. So let me see here. It should totally be possible. I just want to confirm that the target. Yeah, I think this won't be too hard. I'm going to do a little test one first, just so we can get some information. This is me literally writing a little bit of code to confirm that my assumption is correct, right? I'm not sure if this works exactly the way I think, but let's see. Log target event console.log event target was, all right, we'll just log this event.target. And I'll just do the, where am I, just type, I think type will be fine. Target might be okay. Let's just try that first. Chrome tools are nice enough to help me there. So now what I'm going to do is document body dot add event listener, click log target. Let's see if this works or not. I don't know what's going to happen. If I click here, okay, yeah, good. So you'll notice it's giving me information about what the target was, and the target isn't actually the body element, even though that's where the event listener is. And that's because of this. I don't have any images of this. Let me see. That's because of how this event bubbling concept works. And this is even more deep than you guys need to know, but if we have a div or whatever we had, the event is actually going to, so it's going to fire the event on the element that you clicked on. But if you don't have any listeners attached, then there's nothing to do with that directly, right? So then it's going to keep moving up the chain looking for any event listeners. And it's going to say, oh, are there any on this div? What about this body? And when it sees one on the body, it's like, oh, okay, now I need to invoke that event listener. But it keeps track of what was the actual element that was clicked on in the page, as well as where the event listener is attached, right? So that target information is saying, ooh, what did they actually click? And even though I'm attached up here as an event listener, here was the actual target that they used. And so that's that concept of bubbling. It's like bubbling that event up, 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 up. And that lets us write something very efficient where we only had to attach one event, and yet we can get information about everything that we click on the page, right? So if we were to take that, and let's just continue to do our silly bit of logic instead of something totally legitimate and meaningful. We're going to create, I'm so lazy. We'll do that. And now let's do document.body.add event listener. Click, change color. I think now we've got the color changing, but we only had to attach it at one place, and it should work for everything. In our image and our table and every little bit. And that's because of this concept of event bubbling. Again, don't worry too much about that. That's something you will end up encountering. But it's not something that you probably need to focus on it first in terms of learning. But it's a useful thing to know, because especially in a lot of older documentation talking about jQuery or anything talking about jQuery, they'll talk about, don't attach event listeners all over the place. Attach them at this higher level and use event bubbling to handle it, because it's just much more efficient. Whereas when we get into React, you instead React is, it does some magic. You get to do stuff in the what would be inefficient way, and behind the scenes, React is like, I'll do that efficiently for you anyways. So you get to act like, oh, I'm doing it in this really bad way because I know it would be bad for performance if I was writing that directly in the program. But React under the covers is like, I got you.
So is like jQuery like slowly dying? It seems like a lot of people are like
I wouldn't say jQuery is slowly dying because of React. I think jQuery is still heavily used. jQuery, I mean, to go into a little bit of the history of why it became so big in the first place is, you saw me just call this add event listener method to attach an event handler, right? Nice, easy, clean. Let's see, let me see here. Like, let me go back a little bit. So like here is you have to do it differently in older versions of IE. They didn't have add event listener, for example. So you would have to have code scattered in your code. You can't write something that's just generic that says like, oh, whenever I want an event listener, I call this method on stuff, because different browsers had different methods. So you'd have to be like, am I in IE? Try and attach it this way. Or does this method exist? No, it doesn't exist. Try if this other method exists. Try and use that one to attach it, right? So you ended up with a lot of really kludgy conditional code just scattered in your code that was basically, am I on this browser? Do it this way. Am I on this browser? Do it that way, right? Except that is like, you'd be writing the same logic over and over, and everyone's doing that same logic because you want to have one way to detect what browser you're on. So why should I rewrite it and you rewrite it if I can make a function that I share with everyone that says like jQuery events, events, like why shouldn't I be able to have a unique way to say like .bind to attach event listeners, and that will know what browser or have all of that logic embedded in it to know what browser I'm on, right? So one of the big things jQuery did for a long time was it abstracted away all those differences. If you did jQuery, I don't care if I don't have to write all this custom in my Internet Explorer, in my Chrome, in my Firefox logic. I just get a right to the jQuery interface and it hides all those details. And so that's a lot of what jQuery did was abstracting that away. But since browsers have standardized a lot more, you don't need to do as much of that, which has made it a lot easier to not have to use jQuery in those places. And then I think this isn't React specific, the other reason why jQuery doesn't get as much hype or as much use is the rise of what we talked about just at the end of last class, which is these single page applications. So whenever you've got these JavaScript frameworks that are intended to help own the whole page, render everything on the page, then jQuery doesn't really buy you as much as it did before, because jQuery is a great way to take a web page and add bindings all over the place to do special things. But when you already have a bit of JavaScript that's rendering your whole page, why do I need something else to bind to all these events and do all this stuff? I'll just do it inside of my JavaScript that's rendering the whole page, right? So between those two, it just doesn't have as much of I'm not saying it's not a great tool. I still pull it in some of the projects I do when I know that this is one of those things. It's going to be browser difference and it's going to be annoying, and it's just easier to write jQuery instead of it is to write all that logic myself. But in a lot of times now, you don't necessarily need it. It was a good question. Good thought. Anything else? We can keep playing around with this. I may have talked much faster today than normal. I don't know. I thought this was going to take fair bit longer, sort of showing off these examples of working with events. We could always play with other events if you guys are interested in that too. But they're all a very sort of similar pattern, if you will, of hooking up to them and then figuring out what you want to do that's unique for a given event. Oops, I don't know what happened there. But there are, again, these are all the different types of events. So that's just even beginning to show you. And in those, there's a lot of different events for each one of those categories too. So there are a ton of different events that get fired in your browser for a whole bunch of different purposes that are useful to hook into when you want to do stuff. And that's really the key binding there. That's after you've done that binding, like even the single page application frameworks use that model under the covers. All of these event bindings, their way of communicating with the web page. Questions, comments, thoughts? Everyone just wants to go out and look at the classic cars out there on the road right up there. There's classic cars out there. They're pretty cool. No, nothing else? All right. So again, reiterating, this is the last class for this intermediate. Please still follow up with the to-do stuff. I've been seeing some people post where they are with their to-do project. But that's sort of this, and some people have even, built out UIs for it versus even just writing something more basic, which is awesome. But the goal there is to just keep working on something that's a little larger scale than like a single function or a single method or a single object. And because that's really what we're going to have to be tackling going forward. It will be several weeks until we start up the next class, but I'll be sending out some links for things for you to start working on or reading through in order to sort of prepare for the introduction to React. I can do the first one right now, which is, this one should be pretty simple because it's not really a coding thing. And I really recommend you, I mean, they'll show some code, but this is really about, the key part here is at least down through step one, like read through step one of this. And I would suggest read through step one of this several times. Because it should not be that foreign. It should be similar to what I've talked about, which is build stuff out of small building blocks. Do small building blocks and compose. It's just applying that to React. But read through that to start thinking about, this is the way to think about building a website with React. And if you really want to, start working on that, even take a look at other sites, for example, and say like, okay, I've got a website here or a piece of a website. What would be the small pieces of this if I was turning it into building blocks? Because that's sort of the foundation. If you succeed there, then building out all the concepts, yeah, it's going to be a challenge, but it's going to be less challenging than if you are also trying to build it all into one giant React component. But that'll be, I'll be posting some other stuff to help prep for the React course, or if you still want more emphasis on coding or you want some coding practices, I'd be fine with any of that, right? If somebody's like, hey, here's a coding challenge that we want to do in the meantime to keep working on stuff, or have at it. I'd be happy to participate in any of that as well. In the meantime, right? There's so many different places where you can go practice some of your coding and sort of scale it up bit by bit. All right, anything? Oh my gosh, yes. I still need to follow up with Daisy. I did not. I have to get an answer, so I will be posting something. I mean, yeah, I've got to follow up with them and figure out what's going on. I just always forget. What?
Is there also a possibility
Message me. I've been saying like, please message me with your preferences. The more I have like people saying something, like it gives me information about where we should go. So, I just want to hear from as many people as possible on that. Which location you would prefer? Yeah.
I just want to say, this is the point at which my knowledge of JavaScript.
No.
It was an honor to help you guys. You guys have made tremendous progress over the last several months. You guys have been about any backgrounds in programming at all, and you guys found out a lot about JavaScript and web development. And you guys can talk about that. Anyway, yeah, I think you guys have done an awesome job. I'll try to follow up with people at some point, especially the people who talk to parents. There was a demo day that people from one of the last cohorts did. February or March, I don't remember, but it was seriously impressive to see the websites that those interns have developed for like real organizations, like the people that go on to do internships. You guys are like doing real work for real organizations, and I was like blown away by the stuff that the people have done, both in terms of the front end, the way the design look, and all the functionality that the students have built into their apps. So yeah, I think I see comments for all of you guys to kind of reach that step, and I'll follow up whenever that step occurs and and if I can just give a few points of advice, just remind you guys, when you guys run into problems that you feel really stuck on, take a break and go do something else. Go outside, take a walk, come back to the street, get back to the next day. Like, I was talking to Nick about the stuff, and I was like, well, I had to have this happening last week, right? I heard something, and I was so stuck. I was like, I'll never figure this out. And I was like, this is going to take us a week. Took a break. I went to bed. I woke up the next morning. I started working on finishing. So sometimes you just need to like clear your head, and just remember like you've always been going through the class. Break things down as simple as possible. Just do things that you gotta do first, and then just build upon that. That's my advice for all part of this.
I should have gotten you something. Nah. All right. What? I'm stuck with you guys? Well, good. Keep at it. Keep harassing me when I fail to follow up online or other things.
Yeah.